Halloween night was in full swing, and the air was filled with the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the distant sound of laughter echoing down the street. Houses glowed with jack-o'-lanterns, their grinning faces flickering as if they knew something no one else did. In the middle of it all, a group of trick-or-treaters, Max, Lucy, Ben, and Emma, stood huddled under a street lamp, plotting their next big prank. Max, the ringleader of the group, had a mischievous grin on his face. Okay, here's the plan. Old Mrs. Holloway's house is up next. We've egged her place before, but this time we're going bigger. A full-on toilet paper ambush. Ben snorted. Yeah, because nothing says Halloween like TPing the house of a poor old lady. Lucy elbowed him playfully. Come on, it's tradition. Plus, she always gives us those weird raisin candies. She's asking for it. Emma, the quiet one, glanced nervously around. I don't know, guys. Something feels strange tonight. Have you noticed how dark it's getting? The moon's almost hidden behind the clouds. Max waved her off. Relax, it's just Halloween vibes. That's the fun of it. With that, they set off toward Mrs. Holloway's house, arms full of toilet paper rolls, ready to unleash their prank. The old house loomed at the end of the block, its windows dark and curtains drawn. It looked more abandoned than usual, as if the house itself had slipped out of time, forgotten by everyone except for the mischievous kids who targeted it year after year. Max tossed the first roll, the white stream flying through the air and unraveling as it wrapped around the gnarled branches of the trees. The others followed suit, laughter breaking through the stillness of the night. In minutes, the house was covered, the trees draped in webs of toilet paper like some eerie Halloween decoration. Just as they were about to make their escape, a strange rustling sound stopped them in their tracks. The laughter died, replaced by a tense silence. Lucy's eyes darted to the trees. Did you hear that? Emma, her nerves already on edge, clutched her candy bag tighter. It's probably just the wind. But it wasn't the wind. From behind the trees, shadows began to move, too fast, too deliberate to be anything natural. The kids froze, eyes wide as small figures stepped into the dim light of the street lamp. They weren't human. Short, hunched, with pointed ears and glowing eyes, the creatures grinned with sharp teeth, their laughter high-pitched and mocking. Nice work, one of them said, his voice like the crunch of leaves. We've been watching you. Max swallowed hard. Who are you? The lead goblin, for that's what they had to be, stepped forward, his crooked hat casting a shadow over his face. We're the real pranksters of Halloween, and we've seen what you've done. Now it's time for a real challenge. The air seemed to grow colder as the goblin pointed a bony finger at the group. If you win, you'll never run out of candy again. But if you lose, well, let's just say your tricks will last forever. Ben, trying to shake off his nerves, laughed weakly. Yeah, right. We don't believe in goblins. The goblin's grin widened. You don't have to believe in us, kid. You just have to play. Max looked at his friends, trying to muster up some courage. What's the challenge? The goblin clapped his hands, and the shadows around them shifted, deepening the darkness. 3 challenges, 3 chances. Win, and your pockets will be full of candy until the end of time. Lose, and your tricks will never end. Sound fair? Lucy, her face pale but determined, nodded. We're not scared of you. Good, the goblin said, his voice dripping with mischief. Let's see if you can survive the first challenge. A race against shadows. With that, the streetlights flickered out, leaving the kids standing in total darkness, the goblins' laughter echoing around them like a sinister melody. The darkness felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. Max could barely see his friends, but he could hear their uneasy breaths and the quick shuffle of feet as they huddled closer together. For a long, tense moment, nothing moved. No wind, no sound, just the oppressive silence that filled the space between them and whatever lurked in the shadows. And then, out of the blackness, came the sound of soft footsteps. The goblins reappeared, their glowing eyes flickering like candles in the night. Their crooked, twisted bodies moved with a strange grace, and they seemed to melt out of the darkness itself. One of them, a little shorter than the others, tilted its head, studying the kids with amusement. "Scared already?" it asked, its voice as scratchy as a dried leaf. "We're not scared," Max shot back, though his voice wavered just enough to betray him. The goblins chuckled in unison, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. The lead goblin stepped forward again, his twisted cane tapping lightly on the ground. "Oh, I think you are. But that's good. Fear makes the game more interesting." Emma, clutching her candy bag like a lifeline, whispered to Lucy, "What do we do?" "We have to play their game," Lucy replied, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. Her eyes flicked between the goblins and the street, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The lead goblin grinned, his sharp teeth gleaming in the faint moonlight. "It's simple," he said, as if reading Lucy's thoughts. "There's no running, no hiding. Just you, us, and the game." He pointed again, this time at the street behind them. "You'll start here, and if you can reach the old oak tree at the end of the block before the shadows catch you, you win." Ben squinted into the distance, but the street seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The old oak was barely visible, a hulking shape at the very edge of their vision. "That's it?" he asked, trying to sound brave. "Just a race?" The goblin's grin widened, showing more of those jagged teeth. "Oh, it's more than a race, boy. It's a race against shadows." He waved his hand, and the darkness seemed to ripple. The shadows around them shifted, and from the deepest part of the blackness, shapes began to emerge. Tall, lanky figures with glowing eyes, their limbs stretching unnaturally as they moved. "Those are the shadows," the goblin explained, his voice dripping with glee. "They'll chase you. If they catch you, well, let's just say your pranks will never end. You'll be playing tricks for all eternity." Max's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at his friends, each of them looking just as terrified as he felt. But there was no turning back now. The goblins had them trapped, and the only way out was to play. "Ready?" the goblin asked, raising his cane. Max swallowed hard and nodded. "Let's do this." The goblin cackled, then brought his cane down with a sharp thud. "Go!" Without thinking, Max bolted forward, his feet pounding the pavement as he ran. Lucy, Ben, and Emma were right behind him, their breaths ragged in the still night air. The old oak tree loomed ahead, but it felt impossibly far away. And behind them, the shadows were moving, silent, eerie, their glowing eyes fixed on the kids as they gave chase. "Faster!" Lucy yelled, her voice barely audible over the sound of their frantic footsteps. Max pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort. He risked a glance back and immediately regretted it. The shadows were closing in, their long, dark limbs reaching for them like twisted fingers. "We're not going to make it!" Ben cried out, panic rising in his voice. "Yes, we are!" Max shouted back, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The tree was getting closer, but so were the shadows. His heart hammered in his chest, and every step felt like it took him further into the darkness. Just when it seemed like the shadows would catch them, Emma suddenly veered to the left, darting between two parked cars. The others followed, and the shadows hesitated for a moment, as if confused by the sudden change in direction. "Keep going!" Max urged, his eyes locked on the oak tree. It was just a few yards away now, but the shadows were still closing in. His lungs burned, his legs felt like lead. But he couldn't stop. Not now. With one final burst of energy, Max lunged forward, his hand slapping the rough bark of the old oak tree. The others stumbled in behind him, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was still. The shadows stopped moving, hovering just at the edge of the street, their glowing eyes flickering before they slowly faded into the night. The goblins reappeared, clapping their hands slowly. "Well done," the lead goblin said, though his grin never faltered. But that was just the first challenge. Things only get trickier from here. The goblin's slow, mocking applause sent a chill through the air. Max, Lucy, Ben, and Emma stood gasping for breath beneath the old oak tree, the bark rough under their hands as they leaned against it for support. They had made it, but just barely. Max could still feel the cool brush of the shadows at his heels as they'd raced, and now, as he looked back down the street, it seemed even darker than before. The lead goblin stepped forward, his eyes glowing in the night. Well, you surprised us. Not many make it through the first challenge, but don't get too comfortable. You still have 2 more to go, and they're not so easy." Ben, who had been nervously adjusting his hat, finally spoke up. "What now? Another race? Another creepy shadow thing?" The goblin chuckled, a dry, scratchy sound that made Emma shiver. "Oh no, boy. We're done with running for now. The next challenge is something much sweeter, but not without its twists." As the goblin spoke, the ground in front of the kids shifted. The street seemed to ripple like waves across a black ocean, and then it began to transform. Candies appeared, massive lollipops, gumdrops, chocolate bars the size of cars, and swirling, sticky streams of caramel that ran between them like rivers. It was as if they'd stepped into a gigantic candy land, but something about it felt off. The colors were too bright, too unnatural, and the smell of sugar hung in the air so thick it was almost sickening. "Welcome," the goblin said with a grin, "to the candy maze." Emma's eyes widened. "A maze? We have to go through that?" The goblin nodded, tapping his cane against the ground. "Indeed. Somewhere in that maze is the way out, but not all paths lead to safety. Some will take you deeper, to where the tricks are endless. Your task is simple. Find the way out before the maze swallows you whole." Max exchanged a glance with his friends, his stomach knotting with a sense of dread. This wasn't like running from shadows. This was a puzzle, and they didn't even know the rules. But there was no turning back now. The goblins were watching, their sharp eyes gleaming with anticipation. Lucy, ever the brave one, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "Let's do this. We stick together, right? No splitting up." Max nodded. "Yeah, together. We'll figure it out." The 4 of them cautiously entered the maze, their shoes sinking slightly into the soft, gummy ground. The walls of candy rose high around them, twisting and turning into what seemed like an endless labyrinth of sugar. The paths ahead were narrow, and some were blocked by large chocolate boulders or sticky taffy barriers. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of giggling, goblin laughter no doubt echoing through the maze. They took their first turn, then another, carefully choosing their path. Max led the way, glancing over his shoulder to make sure the others were close behind. Every step they took seemed to lead them further into the maze, and the air grew heavier with the scent of candy. It was so sweet it was nauseating. "We're going in circles," Ben muttered after a while, kicking at a candy cane that blocked their path. "This place is impossible." Emma frowned, wiping sweat from her forehead. "It feels like the walls are moving. Look, wasn't that giant licorice there a second ago?" She was right. The maze didn't stay the same. The paths shifted behind them, twisting into new shapes when they weren't looking. It was as if the candy itself was alive, changing the way forward, pushing them deeper into its sugary clutches. "Okay," Lucy said, her voice tense. "We need to focus. Look for any signs, anything that might show us the right way." They moved cautiously, taking slow steps, eyes scanning the towering candy walls for any clue. As they turned yet another corner, Max spotted something. A faint glow just up ahead, at the end of a narrow path between two towering marshmallow pillars. "Over there," Max whispered, pointing. "Do you see that light? It could be the exit." Without another word, they hurried toward the glow. The path narrowed, the marshmallow walls closing in on them like giant, squishy hands. But as they neared the light, the sound of goblin laughter echoed closer, louder this time, like they were being watched. "Keep going," Max urged, his heart pounding. They rounded the final corner, and there it was, a doorway made of shimmering candy glass, with the faintest hint of moonlight shining through it. "We found it!" Lucy cried, sprinting ahead. But just as they were about to reach the door, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The candy walls shifted, closing in, the sticky taffy threatening to pull them back into the maze. The goblins' laughter echoed all around them. Max grabbed Lucy's hand and yanked her toward the door. "Go! Now!" With a final push, they burst through the candy glass, tumbling out onto the cold pavement. The candy maze behind them vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of sugar in the air. The goblins stood nearby, their twisted grins as wide as ever. "Impressive," the lead goblin said with a nod. "But don't celebrate just yet. You still have one final challenge ahead." The cold pavement beneath them was a sharp contrast to the sticky, overwhelming sweetness of the candy maze. Max, Lucy, Ben, and Emma lay sprawled on the ground, their hearts still racing from the frantic escape. They had barely made it out in time, and the goblins' laughter echoed in their ears as if mocking their relief. The lead goblin stepped forward, clapping his bony hands together slowly, a wicked grin plastered across his face. Well, you managed to escape the candy maze. Most impressive. I don't think it's over yet. You've only passed the second challenge." Lucy sat up, wiping a smudge of melted chocolate off her arm. "What's next?" she asked, though her voice trembled slightly. The candy maze had been more terrifying than they'd expected, and the idea of facing another challenge filled her with dread. The goblin tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "The final challenge is where the real fun begins." He motioned toward the shadows at the edge of the street. "You've outrun shadows and escaped the maze, but now it's time for a game of wits." Max, still catching his breath, narrowed his eyes at the goblin. "Wits? What kind of game?" The goblin's grin widened, his sharp teeth gleaming. "A game of truth, or dare if you prefer. We like to call it trick or truth." He raised his cane, tapping it lightly on the ground. As he did, the air around them shifted, and 4 wooden chairs appeared in a circle. In the middle of the circle sat an old, cracked lantern, its flame flickering weakly. "Sit," the goblin commanded. Hesitantly, the kids obeyed, each taking a seat in the circle. The goblins gathered around them, their glowing eyes watching intently. Here's how it works, the lead goblin explained, his voice low and filled with mischief. Each of you will be asked a question. If you tell the truth, you're safe. But if you lie, well, let's just say the tricks will never end. And if you refuse to answer, you'll have to face a dare. And trust me, you don't want to choose dare. Max felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a trap. The goblins were toying with them, and he knew that whatever question they asked, it wouldn't be simple. The lead goblin turned to Emma first, his eyes narrowing. Let's begin. You seem quiet. Tell me, little one, what's your biggest fear? Emma's eyes widened and she glanced nervously at her friends. The goblin's grin never faltered. Be honest, he warned. We'll know if you're lying. Emma swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. I'm afraid of the dark, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The goblins all cackled in unison, but the lead goblin simply nodded. Good. An honest answer. You're safe. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Next, the goblin turned to Ben, his grin widening. And you, boy, what prank are you most proud of? Ben hesitated, knowing that the wrong answer could lead to disaster, but he couldn't lie. Last year, we put shaving cream on all the car windows in the neighborhood, he confessed, his cheeks flushing red with embarrassment. The goblins chuckled again, but the lead goblin seemed satisfied. A classic. You're safe. Lucy's turn came next. The goblin's eyes gleamed with interest as he asked, if you could play a trick on anyone without getting caught, who would it be? Lucy bit her lip, her mind racing. She didn't want to answer, but refusing would mean facing a dare, and the goblin had made it clear that was not a good option. After a long pause, she finally said, my older brother. He always gets away with everything. The goblins burst into laughter, clearly entertained by her answer. Honest. Very good, the lead goblin said, nodding in approval. Finally, it was Max's turn. The lead goblin leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And you, Max, what's the biggest lie you've ever told? Max's heart skipped a beat. The biggest lie? He could feel the weight of the question pressing down on him. If he lied now, they'd know. But if he told the truth... After a long silence, Max finally spoke, his voice quiet. I told my parents I didn't take money from their wallet. But I did. I needed it to buy something for school. But I never told them. The goblins grinned, their laughter filling the air once more. Ah, honesty. How refreshing, the lead goblin said, standing up straight. You've all passed the test. Max exhaled in relief, but the goblin's next words froze him in place. But don't think you're free just yet. There's still one final trick left to play. The goblins vanished, leaving the kids alone in the circle, the lantern's weak flame flickering ominously as the shadows around them began to stir once more. The goblins' laughter echoed into the darkness, even though their twisted forms had vanished. Max, Lucy, Ben, and Emma sat in the eerie stillness, their nerves on edge. The flickering lantern in the center of their circle cast long, dancing shadows across their faces, making the world around them feel even more surreal. Max couldn't shake the feeling that the goblins were still watching, somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for their final move. What did they mean by one final trick? Ben asked, his voice uneasy. He glanced over his shoulder as if expecting a goblin to leap out of the darkness at any moment. Max clenched his fists, trying to calm his racing heart. I don't know, but it can't be good. Lucy stood up, pacing around the circle. There has to be a way out of this. They wouldn't just let us go after everything they put us through. Emma, still seated with her knees pulled to her chest, spoke softly. What if the last trick is the hardest? What if it's something we can't win? Max hated to admit it, but Emma's words gnawed at the back of his mind. What if this was the goblins' final game? To make them think they were safe, only to pull the rug out from under them when they least expected it. He stood up, unable to sit still any longer. The air around them felt thick, as if the very night was waiting for something to happen. Then, the lantern's flame flared brighter, casting a ghostly light across the street. From the darkness, the goblins reappeared, this time in a perfect circle around the group, their glowing eyes locked on the kids. The lead goblin stepped forward, his smile sharper than ever. "Ah, you thought it was over, didn't you?" he purred, his voice filled with amusement. "But the real challenge is just beginning. The final test. Trick or truth?" Lucy narrowed her eyes. "We already played your game of truth." The goblin's grin widened. "Ah, but this isn't a game of simple questions anymore. This is a game of choices. Each of you will face one final challenge. Tell the truth, and you're free. But choose to trick us, and you will remain in our world forever." Ben's eyes widened in panic. What does that even mean? What kind of choices? The goblin snapped his fingers, and the lantern's light flickered again. This time, 4 mirrors appeared around them, each one tall and ornate, their frames twisted like vines. Max's heart sank as he realized that the mirrors were not normal. They rippled, as if the reflections inside them were alive. "Step forward," the goblin said, pointing to Max. "You first." Max's legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to move. He stepped up to the nearest mirror, his reflection staring back at him. But something was wrong. The reflection didn't just mimic his movements. It seemed to be watching him, waiting for something. The goblin's voice slithered into Max's ears. "In this mirror, you will see the truth of who you are. Will you face it, or choose to trick us by pretending it doesn't exist?" Max swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew this was the final test, the truth he had to face. He stared at the mirror, watching as his reflection shifted. It showed him things he'd tried to forget, the moments he had lied, the times he had hurt others without meaning to, the secrets he kept even from his friends. The reflection was ruthless, showing every flaw, every mistake. Max wanted to look away. He wanted to pretend that none of it was real. But the goblins were watching, waiting for his decision. After what felt like an eternity, Max finally spoke. "I'll face it. This is who I am." The reflection in the mirror rippled again, and then slowly it returned to normal. The goblins grinned, their eyes glinting with approval. "Very good," the lead goblin said, clapping his hands. "You've told the truth. You may go." Max stepped back, his heart pounding, but a weight lifted from his chest. He had passed the final test, but the others still had to face theirs. Lucy was next. She approached her mirror, her hands shaking slightly. The reflection inside showed her deepest fears: losing her family, being alone, never being enough. Lucy bit her lip, tears brimming in her eyes. But after a long moment, she spoke the truth. "I'm afraid, but I won't let that control me." The mirror stilled, and the goblins nodded in approval. Ben went next, facing a reflection that showed him as someone who always hid behind jokes and pranks to avoid dealing with his real feelings. He hesitated, but eventually he said, "I hide because I don't want people to see how scared I really am, but I'll try to be better." The goblins were pleased once again. Finally, it was Emma's turn. Her reflection showed her insecurities, her fear of not being brave enough. She stood frozen for what felt like forever, but when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. I'm not as brave as I want to be, but that's okay. I'll keep trying. With that, the final mirror faded, and the goblins' laughter filled the air one last time. The lead goblin stepped forward, bowing deeply. You faced our challenges with truth, and for that, you are free. But remember, the trick is never far behind. In the blink of an eye, the goblins disappeared, leaving only the flickering lantern and the cold night air. The kids stood in silence, the weight of their final challenge settling over them like a thick fog. They had won, but the memory of the goblins' games would haunt them forever. The street was still and silent now, the goblins gone, their twisted laughter echoing faintly in the distance. Max, Lucy, Ben, and Emma stood beneath the pale glow of the street lamp, the cool October air biting at their skin. They had done it. They had faced the final challenge, told the truth, and were free. But the victory didn't feel as sweet as they had imagined. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that something still lingered. Max ran a hand through his messy hair, still trying to shake off the eerie feeling the mirrors had left behind. The images of his reflection, showing all his worst mistakes, were burned into his mind. He glanced at the others. They looked just as shaken. Lucy broke the silence first, her voice quiet. Do you think it's really over? Emma hugged her arms to her chest, her eyes wide with worry. It has to be. We passed the challenges, right? Ben kicked at the pavement, his usual bravado gone. I don't know. Something about this feels unfinished. Max couldn't shake the feeling either. He glanced down the street, expecting to see the shadows shift again, or for the goblins to reappear with one last trick up their sleeves. But everything seemed normal. Too normal. The houses were dark, the streets empty, and the world felt eerily quiet. No sign of the candy maze, no rippling shadows, no glowing eyes in the dark. Max forced a smile, trying to break the tension. We did it. We beat the goblins. We're free. Lucy nodded, though her expression didn't quite match his optimism. Yeah, we're free. But even as the words left her lips, a low rustling sound drifted through the air. The kids froze, their eyes darting toward the source. From the shadows, just beyond the glow of the street lamp, something moved. For a split second, Max's heart leaped into his throat. Had the goblins come back after all? Then, from the darkness, a small object tumbled toward them, bouncing lightly on the pavement. It was a piece of candy, a shiny, gold-wrapped chocolate. It landed at Max's feet, and for a moment he just stared at it, unsure whether to pick it up or run. Ben frowned. What's that? Max crouched down, hesitating only a moment before scooping it up. He turned the small piece of candy over in his hand, the golden wrapper glinting in the dim light. It didn't seem dangerous, just an ordinary piece of chocolate. But given everything they had just been through, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Do you think it's from the goblins? Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Max stood up, holding the candy between his fingers. I don't know. Maybe it's a reward? Lucy raised an eyebrow. Or another trick? Ben stepped forward, squinting at the candy in Max's hand. Only one way to find out. Before anyone could stop him, Max tore open the wrapper. Inside was a perfectly shaped piece of chocolate, rich and dark, the scent sweet but faintly bitter. Max's stomach growled. reminding him that they hadn't eaten since before the challenges began. Without thinking, Max popped the chocolate into his mouth. The rich taste melted on his tongue, and for a brief moment all the fear, the tension, and the uncertainty vanished. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Warm, comforting, and sweeter than anything he'd ever had before. He smiled. It's good. Really good. The others watched, waiting for something to happen, for the trick to reveal itself. But nothing came. Max stood there, enjoying the moment, the sweetness lingering. Ben frowned. That's it? No tricks? Lucy shook her head, a small smile finally tugging at the corner of her mouth. Maybe we did win after all. Just as she said that, the ground beneath them gave a small tremor, and a gust of wind blew through the street, swirling fallen leaves around their feet. The wind carried with it the faintest sound of giggling, goblin laughter, far away but still present, like a lingering memory. Max looked down at the empty wrapper in his hand, his smile fading slightly. Maybe we did win, but I don't think they'll ever really leave us alone. The others nodded, sensing the same truth. The goblins might have given them the victory, but their presence would always be there, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting. The tricks might not be over, but for now, they had won. As they turned to leave, heading back toward their homes, Max glanced over his shoulder one last time. The street was quiet, the shadows still. But somewhere out there, he knew the goblins were watching, waiting for the next Halloween, for the next group of trick-or-treaters to stumble into their world. And as the night stretched on, the golden wrapper in Max's pocket crinkled softly, a reminder that the line between tricks and treats was thinner than they had ever imagined.